Hey there guys, it's Metro and welcome to the DPS spec tier list for Mythic Plus Dungeons made specifically for patch 8.1.5 and onward and season 2. In this video we will be ranking damage dealers based on their ability to impact 5-man group and making direct comparisons between melee and ranged and how they interact generally with dungeons and with reaping. It is made up purely of my opinions formulated from running and watching countless Mythic Plus dungeons, as well as information from what might be considered the meta via parsing sites like Raider.io and Warcraft logs, and from the unfortunately limited information able to be gained from this year's Mythic Dungeon Invitational. Before we begin, I would like to note a few elements of the list that you should be aware of before we start. I am ranking these by class with a recommendation where needed in terms of spec for each class, with the exception of Shaman and Druid, as their two specs operate entirely differently and have to stand up to competition within their own class. I am also indiscriminately intermingling melee and range, despite the meta suggesting melee is oftentimes just flat out superior to range in many ways and on certain affixes. Right now, we see a common usage of 2 melee to 1 range, so I will take that time to make a clear breakdown in the pinned comment below where only melee and only range are separated for your benefit. For this list, the most obvious discussion would appear to be the amount of damage the spot can provide, but as many things are equally capable in an AoE heavy world and season, it will be pertinent to compare along these 4 metrics as well. Number 1, not just raw output, but the ability for their DPS to swing situations and be easily aligned with dangerous areas. Number 2, their bulk, i.e. ability to survive without dramatic help in the face of dangerous scenarios. Number 3, their mobility and flexibility in the course of a unique and varying dungeon affix spread across multiple weeks. And number 4, their group-wide utility and how relevant it will be for the group's ongoing success. With all that aside, let's get right into the tier list. Tier 1, number 1, top pick overall is the Havoc Demon Hunter. Havoc continues to be one of the strongest and most flexible specs in the entire game and shines particularly in small group content where things like utility, AoE DPS, and survival display as paramount. The obvious place to start would be their DPS, and they continue to be extremely potent burst AoE damage dealers, which works extremely well with the continued trash priority and reaping in the mix, but of course have more than passable single target and cleave options as well. More so, they are the poster child for what I would consider access to damage. Oftentimes, you might want to plan your CDs around certain packs, only to have things go awry. This is where Demon Hunter shines, as they have tremendous access to AoE, thanks to talents and synergies like Fell Barrage and Demonic with I-Beam, and no matter what happens, Demon Hunter will always be prepared, perhaps ironically. Still, damage isn't even their strongest case. They continue to have absolutely imbalanced bulk to the point of absurdity against specific mechanics. The leech elements that remain a part of their kit will always be strong, but the true strength this expansion comes with Blur and or Blade Dance's iframe, which even on paper looks overtuned to the point of suspect. In practice, it's even better, as you can often taunt or soak a mechanic with it and completely negate that mechanic. And of course, they still have access to a talented immunity, albeit one that prevents your DPS from continuing. If that's not enough, their mobility remains exceptional as well, thanks of course to their mastery, which will always be potent, and topped off by double jump plus glide, which works even better for Havoc than it does for Vengeance thanks to Fell Rush. But without question, the single most important reason they are tier 1 number 1 is their utility kit. They boast the widest and arguably most powerful utility kit of all melee and perhaps all specs overall thanks to the following: a very low CD AoE stun that actually functions in their DPS component, a 5% magic damage buff that can only be brought by Demon Hunters, a purge, which again functions in their DPS component, a 10-yard ranged interrupt, which again functions in their DPS component, the ability to taunt or soak with Blur/Blade Dance, which can effectively negate many difficult mechanics for the tank, some decent snaring options thanks to a talent and vengeful retreat, one of the only group defensive CDs in the entire game, albeit very difficult to use well, a CC that keeps mobs out of combat, albeit less useful than it was in Season 1, and the occasional usage of Spectral Sight that will give insight into stealth mobs like Untitled Chapter. So honestly, Demon Hunter just have too many upsides. Blizzard seems to be satisfied with this, so for now, and perhaps always, Demon Hunter will remain an extremely potent pick, if not the most potent. Tier 1, number 2. Number 2 overall is Rogue. Rogue is the first entry on this list with multiple spec options, but you could not tell it by looking at the MDI. Rogue has been in the unique position for effectively 2 seasons now of having 3 specs all be extremely capable, all while not sacrificing any of what makes them overall strong. But if you are a meta slave, you will likely come to find the intense AoE Outlaw provides to be too consistently potent in a world with Reaping on top of that, despite them having a less reliable single target output. Either way, the most important thing that everyone should immediately recognize about Rogue, no matter what spec they're playing, is Shroud of Concealment. This single utility spell is enough to make them a mandatory pick, effectively number 1 overall by a mile when it's actually needed. No other spec or combination of specs in the game can offer anything remotely as potent, but when it's not needed, it has a 0 usage case whatsoever, and sometimes even is countered by mobs that can see stealth. When it's good, Rogue is mandatory, but even when it's not, Rogue can still do very well. Shroud, of course, isn't their only utility either. They still have things like Distract for patrols, Blind for in-combat CC, Sap for out-of-combat CC and potential skipping, and multiple single-target stuns and interrupts with abilities like Cheap Shot. Perhaps most useful overall, however, is Tricks of the Trade, which will help particularly with Reaping, but Mythic Plus in general now that Threat is on the table again, and of course even more so on skittish weeks. They also can still pull off typical Rogue shenanigans with Vanish and Cloak to clear or negate targeted abilities, something that used to be very widespread in the past, but now has less usage. And perhaps most niched, but another element of near mandatory usage is Pick Lock, which is useless most days, but extremely strong in the dungeon Toll to Gore, and despite being able to be brought by other professions, they are the only actual class that can offer it. On top of this, they have very straightforward but effective mobility. Sprint and Shadow Step are all any melee could ever want, both on short CDs and with high access alongside various passives and talents. Not top tier mobility, but certainly not bottom either. And of course, no Rogue ranking could be made without talking about their unique bulk. On paper, Rogue doesn't have the prototypical bulk you might want to see from a melee, certainly not when compared to their tier 1 peers. But as mentioned before, theirs can be even better in the right cases. They have 2 bread and butter spells in Cloak of Shadows and Evasion, and using them both well will not only dramatically increase your ability to survive, but also potentially remove entire mechanics from encounters. However, they have no way to reliably gain threat, like a Demon Hunter might, so Demon Hunter offers a better use case in that situation. They also have Feint, which is another spell that used to have far more usage in dungeons, but still will be extremely valuable when it is good, and received an actual self-heal a while back, which rounds off their kit very nicely. Don't forget, even though vanishing targeting spells is listed in utility, it's still effectively preventing damage taken. And finally, let's talk about their damage. All 3 Rogue specs can be looked at as having a niche in terms of DPS, and even after changes in 8.1, this still remains to be the case. Sub still has very good burst and priority damage, Assassination has great sustain damage, and I consider the best single target DPS, and Outlaw has absolutely explosive but luck-driven burst, especially on AoE, but will oftentimes suffer from bad rolls on single target situations. The overall summary here is Rogue is a very capable damage dealer, short and sweet. You might see any of the 3 specs top the chart, and doing so seems easy for them thanks to the potent talents and Azurite traits they have, but the main reasons you'll bring rogues to dungeon is not going to be their damage alone. The way I always look at it is a rogue is mandatory pick when you need their utility, and a solid pick every other day of the week, but still looking up to Demon Hunter for that very reason. Tier 1, number 3. Number 3 overall is Balance Druid. Coming in as a top range overall, Balance, or Bombkin as it's affectionately known, has been an extremely potent pick in dungeons since the start of Legion. Like Legion, their damage output likely won't ever blow you away like many other specs, but they offer very potent CDs for burst options and still operate extremely well in spread AoE situations, where this flexibility will offer consistent and strong damage no matter the type of the pack. Ironically, damage is likely what they do least effectively right now, so let's get into the meat of their strength, their utility. They have one of the most potent utility kits in the entire game at this moment, thanks partially to the width of it, but also to the reliability of it. Their most effective single utility, in my opinion, is the Talented Force of Nature. This spell offers a massive window with respect to its CD, where the tank does not have to actually take damage from trash, so they are effectively offering the best tank external in the game, and it's coming from a ranged damage damage dealer slot with only a 1-minute CD while it lasts for 10 seconds. Trents are good, but Solar Beam might be even better when you need it most. With the increased pull count and reaping on top of it, the likelihood you'll need Blanket Silences in Season 2 have gone through the roof, and Balanced Druid offer one of very few options for this. This spell alone is enough to make them stand out, but it should be mentioned that it being a long CD interrupt means others will have to pick up the slack on certain bosses or situations like you might find in Shrine of the Storm. Obviously, having a battle res is a dramatic help to their kit overall as well. Typically, I would want to see battle res on the tank or the healer slot, but if it had to be on a DPS, Balance offers the best option as they have no huge downside to using theirs, have reliable bulk, and you can res people at range with it. Typhoon is still in the game, although its usage certainly isn't what it used to be. It can still function very well in situations where you need it though, and of course can offer an AoE interrupt with a small downside, and still operates as a great counter to the Sanguine affix, but it does still compete alongside Mass Entanglement if for some reason you ever need that. Speaking of affixes, Soothe might be their biggest boon since Legion, as not only have many more mob types been capable of standard enrages, but the raging affix is now dispellable for some strange reason. This makes them an even better pick, if not a mandatory one on raging weeks, especially in certain dungeons like King's Rest. They also still have mediocre access to CC, including the return of Hibernate, but as it effectively can only be used on beasts, you won't see much use with it. Roots, however, still have some good use cases, but simply not as strong as they were in Legion. And last but not least, they also have Innervate, which obviously is much more useful in raids than it is in 5-mans, but still offers some upsides to well-coordinated groups looking to maximize every second, and actually has an Azerite trait that makes that coordination very profitable. So utility is pretty plainly their true strength, but they're also still very capable in the bulk category, despite massive nerfs since Legion. They still have the shortest defensive CD in the game in Barkskin, and now that we aren't dealing with telegraphed one-shots every boss like in Legion, the spell's value goes up. However, this also means the value of Bear Form goes down, and on top of nerfs, it's unlikely you'll ever see a Bombkin Bear hybrid out there anymore. However, it is still an option. A better option now seems to be Resto Affinity instead, as the ability to toss out heals they offer from this talent can be extremely useful in between packs, and of course, the persistent hot doesn't hurt either. Bombkin also still get a massive amount of extra armor from their form, but it's difficult to say just how useful that is nowadays when damage dealers aren't fending for their lives every single boss pull. And they still have Renewal, which is a tough choice as far as talent go, but is extremely potent and even more healing if needed. With all of these things together, you might see Balanced Druids doing quite a lot of HPS from dungeon to dungeon. In terms of mobility, however, this may be their biggest stumbling point since Legion, but the main reason it was so important isn't as present either, minus a few situations. Obviously, losing Displacer Beast does hurt, as it removed not only mobility, but potential defensive ramifications as well, but they still operate heavily off dot damage, meaning plenty of opportunities to move during your rotation, and of course, still have cat form and all that it affords, alongside the oft overlooked feral affinity. That's probably because it contains the word feral. More on that later. So as far as ranged go, Druid's well-rounded bulk and extremely potent utility propel them to the very top. Their damage isn't the highest the game could possibly provide, but the style of damage they do can be extremely useful within their CDs, and you aren't seeing a ton of ranged damage dealers and keys all around nowadays, but if it were up to me, I would take a Balanced Druid to every single one I ever do. Tier 1, number 4, is the Rat Pally. Ret is historically a spec I would give very little credit to, and usually I would look at their utility as very poor, but things have taken a very dramatic change in Season 2. Right now, Ret stands tall on the back of its main strengths, but struggles to cover up for their weaknesses very clearly. Their main strength, as I see it, is something I mentioned at the top of this list, something I'd refer to as access to damage. Their ability to turn up so profusely thanks to their CDs, Azerite traits, and talents is often at times seen as unbelievable, even by other meta specs like Demon Hunter. This on reaping alone will have massive value, as it's the definition of controlled burst scenarios. They live and die by this though, as if the reaps or big pulls happen right before bosses, expect relatively poor single target DPS outside of CDs. However, the main reason I am so high on them right now is their newly found utility. Rat has all the same utility as Prop Pally, which I famously panned in my tanking tier list, but in comparison to other damage dealing specs, it's actually fairly quite useful. To quickly recap, Bop is invaluable when it's actually needed, but pretty useless elsewhere. elsewhere. It's very good on necrotic or grievous weeks though, and can now be used for great effect on abilities like the Axe Bleed and King's Rest as well. Freedom isn't supremely useful nowadays, and I still struggle to think of any slam dunk cases that aren't already overridden by other abilities, but if you know of some, please let me know down below. They can also dispel many dangerous debuffs, and likely need to, as the meta healers aren't able to bring this type of dispel at this time. They do not have Blessing of Sac, which would be really strong in their spot, but they actually have something much better. That's Word of Glory. Word of Glory, in my likely biased opinion, is the best utility in the entire game from every spec possible, and combined with the ability to crit and be increased by wings, you can easily top the HPS charts in 2 globals if used and timed well. The problem is, it uses holy power, so it means you aren't using that holy power to do damage. But in Pugs, I feel like as long as everyone survives, doing less DPS is not going to make or break your dungeon. Still, that is likely why others will not rate it as high, because your standard DPS mentality is to simply never do something like this, and peak performance groups don't need help from damage dealing specs to keep everyone alive. Perhaps even stronger still is Wake of Ashes. This is a 45-second DPS CD that doubles as one of Ret Palad's strongest utility right now, thanks to Reaping being entirely comprised of undeads. The ability will stun every susceptible undead it hits for 5 full seconds, making it the longest AoE stun in the game, and already something people will be using as its key to their damage output. There is nothing more satisfying than a Rock Ellie corralling all the casters into a Wake of Ash and seeing them all die without casting a single time. And of course, last but not least, they also have Lay on Hands. My opinions on this are skewed as a 10-year Paladin player, but the amount of lives I have saved with this spell is countless, so it always has a spot in my heart. It's good on tank and healing slots, of course, but it's amazing on the DPS slot, because just when you least expect it, you might make a huge play that saves further mistakes or perhaps even a full wipe. The best way to define Paladin is by their support style utility and even offense, but sadly, most will define them by their absurd lack of mobility. Mockingly described as a wheelchair spec, Ret really struggles to keep up with the melee surrounding them. They effectively have no mobility outside of horse, without a talent is absurdly long. It's supposed to be made up for by being the fastest speed boost, but that seems less important to me in 5-mans than one might expect. Most frustrating about the whole situation though is that the Cavalier talent is on the same row as one of the best defensive talents in the entire game, known as Unbreakable Spirit. So that leads us to the last thing we should discuss, and that is of course their bulk. No matter where I would have placed them in previous expansions or seasons, there is one absolute truth to the Ret Paladin. Their bulk is unbelievably good. Typically, I would say they're number 1 in terms of bulk when ranked, but many will disagree and say Demon Hunter should be number 1, and I can totally understand why. Thing is, Paladin's bulk is a lot of long CD healing, and they have no actual percentage damage reduction, but they do have multiple immunities. Using these immunities, alongside Lay on Hands and Shield of Vengeance well, will have Ret seemingly unkillable, but sadly, you'll often be using them only because you'll pull threat when you pop all your offensive CDs. So upon reflection, Ret Pally really hasn't changed much from previous seasons or expansions. Their damage is a lot more applicable now, but a lot of this value is thanks to Reaping and, of course, Word of Glory. Once Reaping goes, and I remain the only person who ever uses Word of Glory for impact, Ret will be left standing there with top tier bulk and dead last mobility. For now, at least, they reside number 4 overall and the last into tier 1. Tier 2, number 1 is the Elemental Shaman. Unless you've been living under a rock elemental for the last decade, you probably already know Ellie's upsides. Very capable AoE and absurd single target burst with absolutely absurd utility to boot. Let's get right into their utility and the obligatory listing of everything they have for effect. First and foremost is said Rock Ellie. Earth Elemental was typically looked at as a long CD capable of saving big mistakes by the tank and not much more. But now, it's a quintessential counter to Reap. The Elemental will taunt everything around it as long as it's attacking, but most importantly, cannot die to Reap as they do barely no melee damage at all, and the magic debuffs they cast cannot apply to it. It can also be used on standard trash, but will take a lot of damage very quickly and either require healing or will die shortly after it's used. Right now, I feel it's best used to corral all Reaping mobs so melee DPS don't have to worry about threat, and an added perk of the Primal Elementalist talent means you could actually control it and potentially use it to move the mobs along with it. Probably second most important is having a ranged interrupt on a melee style CD. As mentioned in the Bombkin section, long CD interrupts oftentimes hold ranged DPS back in this meta, but Shaman is the singular exception to this rule and allows them to fit in much easier to many comps and dungeons. They also have one of very few AoE stuns in the game and still functions exactly the same way it always has, but it now dramatically is buffed by a talent, albeit a talent on a competitive talent tier. Tremor Totem is also back and has some select usage, but particularly particular strength in King's Rest and Atal Azar make it popular. Thunderstorm is still a great knockback or AoE interrupt, but as mentioned earlier, will see less usage than it would have in the past. They have Earthbind Totem now, which offers a very reliable slow for the kiting you might see in Mythic Plus, and Purge is still there, but considerably more useful now that all dungeons are containing more appropriate debuffs that can be dispelled. Windrush Totem is an option, and a great one for many dungeons like Temple of Sethralis, but is on a very competitive tier with a very potent defense-oriented trait alongside it. Also on that same tier is Ancestral Guidance, which used to be brokenly OP if you remember all the way back to MoP, thanks to damage increase phases in many dungeons, but those don't really exist anymore, where healing would also be important on top of that. You can also use Reincarnate as a form of wipe protection, often used in intentional skips, certainly not as valuable as it used to be, but people still do insist on it in many cases. And something so many people seem to miss about Ellie, but that has been extremely potent as far back as challenge modes have existed, is the Earthquake Knockdown. The spell Earthquake has a random chance to knock down mobs that are within it, and this can be extremely valuable in caster-heavy packs, and also has only gotten better over the years with the changes to how often Earthquake can be down. So that, to me, is all anyone should ever really need to see to understand Elemental as being a good spec, who on top of substantial buffs in 8.1 are now crushing DPS spots. However, they have one glaring weakness that holds them out of Tier 1. Both defense and mobility are a very, very sore spot for them. Their defense, especially if you're taking Windrush Totem, is all relying on a single long CD, or simply dying and then resurrecting once or twice a dungeon, and to be fair, this style has actually been helped with an Azerite trait. But outside of Ghost Wolf, they have no mobility whatsoever, and it was even suggested that was intentional as to compensate for their enormous utility and other upsides. If that is so, then I can totally understand that, because no matter what their downsides are, their kit alone is going to make me want to bring every single Ellie Shaman I possibly can to every single dungeon I do. Tier 2 number 2 is Mage. Mage is the second on this list with multiple viable specs, but most noticeable is Frost, thanks to a kit slightly more applicable to 5-mans. Arcane and Fire can be equally strong, and in many ways even stronger, but for this slot, I'm going to assume that the Mage is Frost to maximize their group-based potential. For a long time, the Mage slot was purely brought for its damage output. Frost Mage especially had a very strong kit and ideal style damage for 5-mans on the back of the original 1-minute CD in Frozen Orb. Nowadays, many other specs have caught up and even surpassed them in various ways, but the way I see it, the Mage's kit is much more well-rounded now than it ever has been. Their most valuable asset outside of damage is their bulk. They are top spec in the bulk rankings, thanks to Ice Block giving them one of the very few immunities in the game, but also Ice Barrier, which sort of mirrors Rhett's style of defense. On top of this, Frost Mage has Cold Snap, which instantly resets the CD on both of these, allowing for some very strong combinations. They still have the original Blink, and even though all the other clones have gone away, it still can be a very useful ability to not only get out of damage, but also avoid it entirely for the few target abilities still around. Their utility has also gotten a lot better since Legion. They received a castable group buff, and even though it's likely the weakest in the meta at the moment, it's still a good thing to have in your group. They can still dispel curses, which have some select usage, but not as much, and Spell Steal especially gets even stronger with as many buffs that are in dungeons now. Obviously, having Time Warp is a massive deal, and even though drums are widely used, the actual spell itself is still stronger and much more reliable. But most important is their ability to slow mobs, and even after massive nerfs to the slow, is still extremely potent thanks to the talent Frigid Winds and the various routes they have access to. They also still have access to invisibility, and it can still be used occasionally to prevent a mechanic or two. Frost Mage's mobility has been pretty consistent over the years, and they aren't going to be breaking down any barriers this season, but you know what you are getting with multiple instant casts and a blink or two, so they should be looked at as comfortably middle of the pack on this front and actually serve as a great measure of those above and behind them as a baseline. Right now, I look at Mage as a very stable all-around pick. They have strong bulk, decent utility, above average damage, and talents to help them compete in all situations. Mage is, as always, a very capable pick above average in many ways without any glaring weaknesses, and that is what helps them come in at number 6 overall. Tier 2, number 3, Windwalker Monk. Monk is a spec that has truly been through some ups and downs, tracing back to previous expansions, where it went from absurdly useless to absurdly broken in Legion, then back down to Earth in BFA, and now again used in virtually every MDI comp this year. Regardless of what is happening there, monks themselves have actually kept a very level head, while the unrest should primarily be attributed to the way the meta develops and those specs around them. Monk has and likely always will contain extremely good cleave and priority target DPS. Their CDs are practically built for it, and when you have so many core abilities naturally presenting multi-target DPS scenarios, it's a wonder they don't have higher representation in a world of AoE spam. On top of well-suited offense, you'll find similar utility. Monk has some very wide utility options, but it won't always be the most applicable to the group. They have a 5% melee DPS buff though that only the monk class can bring, and that has been put on display loud and clear with recent events in a melee top-heavy competitive meta, but they have more than that to be excited about for sure. Leg Sweep remains the best AoE stun in the game available to any DPS spec, without any confusion attached to how it needs to be used, and multiple ways to enhance it. They of course also have the pride of any monk spec, Ring of Peace, which has absurd use cases when it's actually valuable. They also have Paralysis, which functions as effective an in-combat CC that works on any target type, unlike most CCs. They also have a variety of other smaller utility, like roots, speed taunts, speed buffs, but likely most noticeable is their ability to dispel poison and diseases, both of which have become particularly punishing in certain dungeons. If that wasn't enough, they also have one of the best designed mobility kits ever. Mobility in the melee slot certainly isn't what it used to be, but when you have so much access to it like a monk has, it's simply hard to discount it. Being able to roll multiple times into a flying serpent kick is something to behold for sure, and all of that on top of Transcendence can be particularly potent when it is actually needed. And of course, they feature bulk that is very versatile, thanks to abilities like Touch of Karma and the 75-point talent tier, including Diffuse Magic or Dampen Harm, all on top of multiple healing options when in a pinch. Monk now has a very balanced option for every type of danger scenario you might encounter in today's Mythic Plus landscape. With all this said, I find myself looking at Monk as the perfect baseline for all other DPS thus far throughout this expansion. Basically, judge yourself based on this pick and use it to leverage your classes or specs' strengths and weaknesses. If they compare favorably to Monk, they are a top tier pick. If they have an unfavorable comparison, then they are a mid or low tier pick. The best case for this barometer is comparing them to Ret Paladin directly. On paper, they actually look extremely similar to Ret. They have outstanding burst cleave with oddly similar Azerite traits and talents that give them further access to free versions of their cleave, but the big difference for me is Ret's ability to utilize immunities and group preservation utility to push themselves and group members past difficult trials, especially ones that occur due to mistakes. If things like huge mobility and Ring of Peace had slightly increased usage again, it could easily go in the other direction for the spec and shake up the entire list and everything we've set up until this point when discussing the top two tiers. Alright, so before we move on to the second half of the tier list, I'd like to give a little forewarning to everybody. Everything we've been discussing thus far has been explaining the strengths of each spec or class, primarily in a vacuum, in order to give credence to their place in a competitive meta, which they clearly are existing in. Everything in Tier 1 and Tier 2 should be looked at as a very equally capable pick and a solid addition to any 5-man team. However, that is not to say that what will still come on in this list is unplayable or intrinsically bad in some way. Just that they're going to be losing head-to-head comparisons against similar specs or roles for various reasons. Those reasons will be what we focus on from now on, and I'm going to attempt to give additional insight into what these specs and classes might additionally improve on in the future in order to eventually edge those picks who are currently above them. So let's begin. Tier 3, number 1, number 8 overall is Hunter, especially Beast Mastery. Hunter is the king of the second half of this list, and it's all thanks to Beast Mastery. Like earlier slots, it's certainly possible to play all three specs to serious efficacy, but for this discussion, I'm going to be presuming Beast Mastery is just flat out superior due to the natural strengths of their pet functions, the lack of an AoE target cap like Marksman has, and the fact that they aren't just another melee like Survival. For the record, I probably should place Survival separately from this pick, but I've seen such an extremely small amount of them in my time, it makes me believe that they're just not worth discussing at all and not different enough to warrant consideration. If anyone would like to make a case for this spec, please let me know first how it compares directly to Beast Mastery and then to any other spec below them. Either way, Beast Mastery is capable in many ways and a shining example of what a tier 3 pick should be. They do some things very well, but those things are not particularly good or useful in this meta, and the things they do poorly really hold them back. Perhaps their best attribute is their access to easy AoE DPS. Especially with Reaping, they can do some spectacular things thanks to what was originally thought by some to be a bugged rapid reload trait, but seemingly is not being adjusted by Blizzard. This trait, in combination with the Primal Instincts trait, allow for essentially wall-to-wall potent aspect of the wild during big AoE pulls and will significantly shave off time on the spell over the course of a dungeon to the point of it being a very accessible DPS increase, unlike other specs. If there were to be a second thing that they excel at, it's easily their ability to move around the combat field. They effectively operate like a melee, but at range. This has various strengths associated with it, especially when it ties into their already strong mobility thanks to aspect of the cheetah and disengage. What I look at as their major room for improvement, though, is their utility. In a world where range are most usable for their niche and strong utility, Hunter just doesn't have that one thing you really want in every dungeon. Their best case is probably Spirit Shock or other pet-focused dispels that allow you to offensively dispel both magic and enrages. No other class can do this, but all range above them can do one of these two. Mage and Shaman can handle dispelling magic, arguably better as it's not attached to the pet's targeting and melee, and Druids can already handle the enrages, but if you're having trouble with the raging effects, it's something to consider having more than one of. Past that, the rest of what they have just feels like a weaker version of those ahead of them. They have Lust from a pet type that for some reason I cannot seem to get hunters to want to use. They have Misdirect, but pet damage does not contribute to it, so it's just excessively weaker than Tricks of the Trade. They have a single target stun, which is unique as ranged go, but they lost Binding Shot stun component, which arguably used to be their best utility. Binding Shot is now just a talented root, which competes with two very good mobility options on the tree, and is obviously worse in every way compared to Mass Root from Druids or the various mage options. They have an excellent hard CC in Freezing Trap, in that it does not care what type of mob you are against, but without Infested, that's going to see seldom use. They have Tar Trap, which is just effectively a mirror of Earthbind Totem from Ellie, and obviously considerably weaker than what Frost Mage brings. And perhaps most importantly, they have the second best ranged interrupt in the game in terms of cooldown, but as a wise man once said, if you aren't first, you're last. And Ellie and Bombkin both have much better use cases for their interrupts. Also, I'd like to note that they are the first ranged DPS that does not have proper access to a defensive dispel. This isn't something I would go out of my way to be excited for typically, but Druid, Shaman, and Mage all have ways to help their teammates and cover for what their healer might lack, even if it's not something that's hugely pressing in most dungeons. They do, however, have a fairly long list of defensive capabilities. It's something we could talk about here, but really what should be said is that they just aren't really needed like they used to be in Mythic Plus dungeons. The danger players would have been presented in a Legion Mythic Plus would have been laughed at by today's Hunter options, thanks to all these pet changes. But outside of a few bosses, primarily in Freehold, there's just not a lot of usages for 3 or 4 different types of healing and survival-based spells at once. And even though they still have things like Turtle to act as an immunity and Feign to negate targeted abilities, I just find their bulk less useful than I probably should find it. Most likely because Druid already have such a similar plethora, but a lot of it is just more flexible than Hunters. All in all, Hunter seems like the ranged equivalent of a Windwalker, but the key concern is them being really balanced in the range slot in the first place. Ranged can be considered so out of favor that if they don't bring something particularly potent or unique, they really have no purpose in most comps. That's where I find Hunter at this point. Stable and with plenty of strengths, but nothing that compares exceedingly favorably to any of the tier 1 or tier 2 specs, especially consider the lack of range spots most groups are considering right now. Tier 3 number 2 is Warlock. Warlock's a unique case, and is actually the reason this list is so delayed. Their previously dominant spec was Demo, and I could still see it being the case, but the difference is much less noticeable now after the massive adjustment they got in the recent patch. Still, the spec remains an incredible powerhouse of offensive output, and stands up very well among, if not above, other ranged damage dealers. Just the difference between them and, say, Destro overall is not very big anymore, and even Affliction can have very strong use cases, so this certainly is not a Hunter type situation. Either way, regardless of spec they play, their damage cannot be in question. Demo especially has access to tremendous AoE and really ramps up heavily with many targets like Reaping presents, but often the problem may be that this ramp up time and lack of burst leaves them struggling to keep up with the pace of other top tier picks, and that is part of why the other Warlock specs might seem more attractive at times compared to Demo. Especially after just discussing Hunter, their lack of mobility is really horrid. All 3 specs need to stand still very frequently to make great use usage of their spells, and Demo especially can get very spammy, so any massive displacement like you might see come with Reaping can disrupt a lot of their potency, and this isn't particularly different for any of the 3 specs. The biggest area for improvement in my eyes is again their utility though. Their utility, compared to the Legion Legendary days, is pretty grim, but what they do have is actually quite unique still. They have the most unique battle res, which I obviously rate very highly. Its ability to be put on targets before they die is huge, as it facilitates skips that otherwise wouldn't be easy to accomplish. But in terms of using it as an actual battle res, it isn't remarkable or more usable than Druids, and I find full wipe death skips to be horribly inefficient these days. It's also just flat out worse than Shaman's equivalent, as theirs does not use a battle res. They also have Demonic Gateway though, which can actually act as a very safe facilitator of skipping, even though many of the places it can be used are actively being destroyed by Blizzard. I'm not actually sure which ones do and don't exist anymore, but historically they have been extremely strong and borderline exploitative by flying through walls and stuff. I do like their ability to dish out Hellstones though, especially as a tank main. If I could use one of those on CD, it would dramatically make my life easier, and even though you can get 3 from Proving Grounds, it is still nice to be able to use more than 3 per dungeon. They still have Banish, which is actually very unique, but pretty useless in terms of actually trying to CC things regularly. However, it does have some niche cases like banishing the ad during the Priestess fight in Atal, or the mask in the dangerous opening pack in Underrot. They also now have Shadow Fury fully accessible and have talents to reduce the CD of it, but it's still the worst AoE stun in the game as it's a 1.5 second cast instead of just instant or a set and forget type style like Ellie. Ultimately, what looks like a huge black eye for the spec is their access to key utility like interrupts. They have an interrupt from the Fell Hunter that is the same CD as a Hunter's countershot, but it requires that pet, meaning as Demo, you're going to have to twist people's arms to the point of argument to even have it used a single time, severely limiting their ability to bring value to certain dungeons, which is really a big problem in a world where range already have an interrupting stigma. If you think it's tough getting them to do that, imagine then asking them to bring the imp out to defensively dispel magic. So utility is a big concern for me, needless to say, especially considering how much they lost coming out of Legion. But it's actually not that different in the bulk field either. Obviously, the famously unkillable affliction from Legion needed to be adjusted, but they now exist in a ranged meta where their peers have things like immunities or massive spread of self-healing, and they're just stuck with this sort of passive bulk that sounds good for raid fights, but just really doesn't do anything other than pad charts and 5-mans, especially coupled with Unending Resolve being such a long CD, and the talented Dark Pack being so nerfed compared to its previous iterations. So really, Warlock only really does one thing well, and that's damage. And it used to do damage better than everyone else, but that's just not the case anymore. Does it still do it better than anyone else? I'm just not sure if it even matters at this point, as with a melee dominant meta already flushed with specs that are speeding all around, dashing in and out of danger, with many flexible utility and interrupts, where can Warlock actually fit in? Right now, I feel like short of a redesign, the class and its specs will always be mid to low tier in 5-man meta, but it's still a very capable pick if you have all of your bases covered and you just need explosive DPS and some weird skips along the way. Tier 3, number 3. Number 10 overall is Death Knight, especially Unholy Death Knight. Before anything further is said, I do want to say that while Frost has some of the best CDs in the game for Mythic Plus type concepts, what it does not have is what has recently been called quadratic scaling of its AoE, and thus it's just mathematically inferior in all multi-target situations to Unholy. In fact, if the number of targets could be scaled infinitely, Unholy DK would be the undisputed kings of DPS hands down. This is actually closely achieved thanks to Reaping, but as we have talked about thus far, damage is not everything, and Reaping is a lot of pad. Instead, what a lot of top groups are doing is using the Reap to give this quadratic scaling to empower the Death Knights, such that they will do immensely more single target DPS as well, similar to how Outlaw Rogue works. All of this on paper is quite confusing and involves a lot of math and theory, so if you want to look into it more, you should read Wowhead's article on quadratic scaling for Unholy Death Knight. Long story short, they have an incredible Azerite trait called Festermite, hugely synergistic talents in Infected Claws and Bursting Sores, and on top of this, they have another talent called Epidemic, which effectively does the same type of damage but with a separate dot interaction. What you are left with is what many might be familiar with who did WoD challenge modes and saw Enhancement Shaman utilized via Fire Nova. Damage that scales exponentially the higher target count you have. So their abundant upsides are clear. Why is this not a top tier spec? Because of literally everything else. Let's start with their mobility. They have the new small speed increase Death's Advance, which also prevents knockbacks, but outside of that, they only have Wraith Walk on a talent row, similar to the Ret example we gave earlier, where they have to choose between either defense or mobility. And this time, both the defense and mobility are much, much worse, as they cannot attack at all during this spell's channel. Truly, a bottom tier option in terms of mobility. So how about defense? Well, they actually got a pretty big buff to their defense recently, which up until those was dead last in a world with absurd melee bulk, and it's still pretty bad compared to the top, but AMS is a dark horse in any discussion where you can not only absorb a lot of magic damage, but negate magic effects like bursting. But the big issue is, again, clearly their utility. They have dangerously little at all, but they do have Death Grip. For those who know me, you know I rate Death Grip as the single best utility in the entire game when you are tanking. When you aren't, it is much harder to use, as it's not your position the mobs are gathering on, so you cannot just blindly grip mobs in, as you might be gripping them away from where the tank and the group might want them. But they also have Battle Res, being the only viable melee spec who has access to Battle Res, and that can have some benefit and likely contributes to their pick in these bleeding edge comps. But again, it's much better to have Battle Res on a ranged or slot that you know will be the last to die, and that just is not happening for Unholy right now. They do actually have the overpowered Grip of the Dead talent that makes Blood DK such effective kiters, but with how important maximizing Death and Decay is for Unholy's burst, you really are not going to be able to use this how the tank wants, and even though it will slow the mobs, it's probably not going to be very useful for reliable kiting. It also competes in a talent row with a single target stun, which is kind of silly if you ask me. They also have the spell Control Undead, but without the actual Abomination pet, you basically can't do this quadratic burst we were discussing, so no Unholy Death Knight is ever going to be stealing a pet for any length of time like a Blood Death Knight would. In the end, their likely best utility ends up being their ranged interrupt, which we know to be just a weaker version than Havoc's, as theirs gives them a resource. So with all that said, Unholy Death Knight ends up being a very unique pick. They basically have the best DPS possible in the game if there is any situation where you can actually utilize it, but that's just not going to happen in most unorganized pug groups, so they will struggle to outcompete those with better cooldowns and maybe even every other spec. They have some of the worst mobility in the game, their utility is just a weaker version of Blood Death Knight's kit, and their defense is mediocre at best in a world with Rep Paladin and Havoc Demon Hunter dominating. So do you plan on pulling 20 plus mobs on top of a boss? Then you should probably bring an Unholy Death Knight. If not, you have many other melee to choose from who all have considerably better kits for the challenges that await you in Mythic Plus dungeons. Alright, Tier 3 number 4, last on what I would consider the viable or mid-tier picks is Shadow Priest. I wanted to add a 4th slot to Tier 3, basically as a nod to Shadow Priest being such an improved spec within the last few years. There was a time when Shadow was, without a doubt, absolutely unusable in 5-mans, mostly due to how their damage worked. They had the worst kit in every viewable metric, spearheaded by very high ramp times on AoE, meaning they could only top charts on high fortified weeks, which used to be very easy in comparison. The way dungeons work now and the way priests work now is very different, and as such, they're a much more appropriate spec right now for 5-mans. They're capable of very good AoE and average single target DPS, but it's not all tied to extremely long ramp times and can actually be considered quite bursty, which is something that was hard to imagine years ago. However, I would still consider them the worst ranged by a mile, which means really bad things overall with how melee dominates, and a big part of why is everything other than their damage, which hasn't improved at all, if not has gotten worse. Their biggest weakness on paper is their defense. It's actually crazy when you compare it side by side to other specs, especially those with immunities. The only real defensive they actually have is Dispersion, which is a fairly strong reduction, but it prevents you from using any spells while it's up. So compare a single use of this to, say, Ice Block, and I think the difference is quite clear. Blizzard has tacked on a 50% movement speed increase to it as well, and I'm sure that helps in some scenarios, but your most effective defense ability tied to your most effective mobility spell being a 2-minute CD and locking you out of damage for 6 seconds is just really poor compared to just about everything else. They do have access to Power Word Shield though, but you'd have to use it a lot to get any real value out of it throughout the course of a dungeon, which actually isn't out of the realm of possibility now that it gives you some resources. As already alluded to, another big problem is their mobility and access to movement. Their best mobility function is also their best defensive function. Let that sink in. Aside from that, they have no more access to instant cast than really any other caster, aside from maybe Warlock, but have far more channels than any other, meaning that sudden movement can really disrupt things for them. On top of this, their only other movement ability is via talent, which is in a painfully awkward talent row for the spec. They have either Body and Soul, which would give them reliable speed boosts, Sandland, which would give them significant utility boosts, or Intangibility, which would give them significant defensive improvement. So which should you take? Either way, you're still going to be exceedingly bad at 2 out of 3 of the most important metrics in 5-mans. So with utility in mind, let's talk more about why they have the worst utility kit of any range, and only slightly better than one other class, that being Warrior. The main issue is many of their utility spells seem to be remnants of old spells, which actually used to be very useful, in comparison with things like Trance or Shroud, which are new inventions more in line with the way the game has improved its combat, they're stuck with things like fear mobs or help dispel. Truthfully, their best chance at having good utility is going to be their ability to dispel both friendly and hostile targets now. They have effectively 3 different ways to do this. They can purge magic effects from enemies with Dispel Magic, which actually has no cooldown, making it slightly better than some of the other options out there. They can dispel diseases from allies, which ends up being very rarely good, but still, as mentioned before, it's nice to have DPS slots that can contribute this. And then their most iconic Mass Dispel, which can actually do either friendly or enemy targets. If this were to be good, it would be best in a situation where you could regularly dispel friendlies and enemies, but I'm just unaware of any situation like this. Most times I have tried to learn more about it, especially on stream. I usually just end up hearing suggestions that it should be used as an extra single magic dispel, like on the last boss of Siege, where the design of the mechanic is to have one out at all times, but this ability actually allows you to have none out every 45 seconds. That might sound valuable, but can it really compare to other things like Earth Elemental or even something like Battle Res or Bloodlust? Still, they also have Vampiric Embrace, which many people will cite as a major utility. I've still yet to see it be potent, but I remember a day when Ancestral Guidance from Shaman was so strong it would solo heal packs in Mop and Wad challenge modes, so I'm sure there must be some strength to it, especially if talented. However, again, compared directly to even Bombkin's Resto affinity, but certainly to Word of Glory from Ret, it's going to be very difficult to convince me otherwise right now. They also have some small utility like Fade, which I'm sure is good if your tank is AFK, and Leap of Faith if he is really AFK, like I myself often am when I get knocked up in the air in King's Rest and saved from the fall damage by an inspiring young Shadow Priest. Speaking of King's Rest, maybe the most practical usage for their utility kit is Shackle Undead, and even though it puts you in combat, it will still be very valuable on extremely dangerous undead pulls leading up to the 3rd boss. They also have been given a group buff back, but of course, they got the worst one out of the 5, as Fort actually is a detriment to have a certain specs with certain affixes like Quaking or Grievous. And last but least, we have this 60 talent row, which contains an almost laughable slew of utility buffs. You can either take a talent that changes your 45-second interrupt into a 30-second one, your AoE Fear into a delayed AoE Disorient, which actually used to be an AoE stun, but apparently that was too overpowered for Shadow's monstrous kit, or a 4-second single target stun on a 45-second cooldown. It's just hard to understand how any of this could actually be in the game compared to some of the other options out there for other classes, especially via talents. But in the end, this is the sad, dim reality of Shadow Priest. There have been many recently trying to convince me that Shadow can be a valuable pick for a dungeon group, and I can understand why. The spec is considerably more fun than it was years ago, has a really unique flavor and fantasy, and is a lot faster paced than its previous version. They are extremely capable damage dealers in the current raid, and not far off from being very strong in 5-mans too. But when you have the worst mobility, the worst defensives, and the worst disjointed utility kit, what purpose is there to taking this pick? No doubt many of the comments on this video will be trying equally hard to convince me Shadow is good. So if you are going to champion that task, please start by explaining concrete ways that Shadow can be reliably better than Warlock and Hunter within the same tier, first and foremost. Until then, I feel it's very generous to say Shadow is in tier 3 after years of absolutely horrendous usage in 5-mans. Tier 4, number 1, 12th overall on this list is the Warrior. There's simply no other way to say it. Warrior's overall kit is in a very odd and bewildering state. Whether we're talking about arms or fury, it just doesn't seem to change much. Both have extremely limited ability to do just about anything other than output significant AoE damage and move around quickly. To best understand the situation, we should look at Mid-Legion as the example most notable. At this point, arms was considered one of the best, if not the best, specs in the entire game for Mythic Plus due to their delete potential and incredibly strong defensives. They didn't really have good utility, but they had all they needed: Shockwave and Commanding Shout. With strong mobility, enormous offense, and 2 very useful pieces of utility, they reigned as a top tier pick for most of Legion. Honestly, not much has changed for them since those days. They still do very big AoE and are capable all around damage dealers, but what really hurts them is their very poor defensive metrics and their absolutely embarrassingly poor utility. utility kit. They still have Commanding Shout, which is now Rallying Cry again for some reason, but it itself isn't as strong as it used to be, and the main reason to use it is effectively removed. In Legion, it was overpowered because there were many straight-up one-shot abilities on bosses that if you couldn't cheese, would be extremely hard to survive otherwise. But those are all now gone from BFA dungeons. What they don't have is Shockwave anymore. It's actually quite humorous, because the two slots with the worst utility spread already were Shadow and Warrior, and they both lost their AoE stun. While a class like Demon Hunter retained it, this really makes no sense whatsoever, but regardless, they literally only have 3 spells total that can even be considered utility now. One is an AoE Fear, and another is an AoE Slow, both which are obviously dramatically outclassed by just about every other slot in the game. Until they get some real utility kit, they simply cannot stand toe-to-toe with just about any other melee on any other front other than damage in today's meta. But their defensive kit is also particularly odd, because compared to many other specs, it seems like they just forgot to add spells for Warrior. Fury has only a single defensive CD in Enraged Regeneration, which is a 2-minute CD and only a 30% reduction, but the real bulk of the kit is meant to be them taking a lot of damage and then healing it back, thanks to a larger health pool and various healing spell interactions. That's nice and all, but not great in affixes that just deal constant damage based on health, like Quaking or Grievous. The Arms defensive kit is much more suited to the typical melee bulk style, but even it is oddly thin. They have, again, only one 3-minute CD in Die by the Sword, which is again only a 30% reduction, but this time 100% parry chance, which is just basically a weaker version of many other short CD equivalents that Rogue and Demon Hunter might have access to. They do have Defensive Stance as a talent, which is unique in that it can just be used passively to always reduce damage, but also reduces your damage done, and has a 10-second lock-in window where you cannot switch in and out of constantly. So basically a much weaker bear form that requires a talent. Good work there. So all in all, your best defensive ability is probably also your only utility spell, that being Rallying Cry. How are these things so wildly inconsistent? How can a spec like Havoc Demon Hunter or Elemental Shaman exist alongside specs like Fury Warrior? Is the damage output, which really isn't remarkably higher than any other spec, really enough for development to be satisfied with their overall kit? Are the past strengths of Warrior something looming large in today's development cycle and content planning? Either way, with how overrepresented Protection Warrior is in the tank meta, I don't necessarily expect much to change here anytime soon. Sadly, even though a great friend of mine and frequent Keystone contributor plays Warrior, I can't help but find their lack of flexibility in the affix system just really makes me wonder how anyone could look at the spec and think it's even remotely viable in today's meta. Tier 4, number 2, number 13 overall is the Enhancement Shaman. So if suddenly Restoration and Elemental Shaman were removed from the game, Enhancement would actually look like one of the most vibrant picks you could possibly make. But this is why we separate them from Elemental, because they vary widely in their usage so significantly that it's almost a disservice to even connect the two within the same class. The problem with Enhance isn't any one specific thing, although they do have dramatic room for improvement. It's that they lose a competition within their own class with Elemental. They just bring nothing that is unique or more powerful than Elemental, and it's been like this for a long time. The major issue is how each interact with the melee or ranged peers around them though. For example, the strengths of Elemental is its extremely wide and powerful utility kit alongside explosive burst AoE and single target damage, while their downsides are a lack of mobility and bulk. Compared to other range, they outpace everyone in utility, are among the top damage dealers in the entire game, especially among ranged, and don't have that much less mobility than any other range out there other than Hunter, or lose that much from their lack of bulk in today's ranged meta. Meanwhile, Enhance's strengths and weakness spread is actually very similar. They have a very wide utility kit, but it's literally just exactly the same as Ellie, minus some slightly worse options, while there are multiple melee with much higher impact kits around them. Consider especially that one of the best reasons to bring Elemental Shaman is because they have a short CD range interrupt. Enhance has the exact same, but every other melee already does also, and now multiple melee also have range interrupts that are just as good if not better. Enhance does have a pretty potent AoE outlook, but they don't burst exceedingly well, and a lot of their output requires procs in their core rotation, so they will likely just do less damage dungeon for dungeon than really every other melee out there. Their weaknesses are still the same too, but they are much worse in comparison to other melee. Compare Enhancement's mobility to something like Warrior, Demon Hunter, Monk, and you'll understand entirely, even though the one thing they have that Elemental doesn't is the Spirit Walk ability. And their bulk? Forget it. It's arguably arguably the worst kit in the entire game, and compared to some of the other melee options, it just really spells bad news for them, especially considering their most reliable defensive spell is a talent that requires you to sit in Ghost Wolf for a few seconds before the damage is coming. Just the fact that they have less potency in their offense, worse CDs, less utility without Primal Elementalist or Earthquake knockdown, and are melee instead of range is enough to force them to the very bottom of this list. That being said, if you actually need the utility they can offer, they're actually a really good pick. Enhancement Shaman really isn't that bad, and it's certainly not as bad as it was in Legion. It's just that anyone actually playing Enhanced right now would be significantly better off playing Elemental. If anyone disagrees, I would love to hear ways that you think Enhanced can excel where Elemental cannot also excel. Because after years of studying this class's ability to dominate or flounder in 5-mans, this iteration of the two specs still remains as clearly one-sided as ever to me. Looks like they would need Fire Nova and that quadratic scaling back that we were talking about earlier in the tier list, huh? And Tier 4, number 12th, finally we come to the long-awaited last overall spot that was without question belonging to Feral Druid. Everything we have just described with Enhancement Shaman applies to Feral squarely as well, but in an even more exaggerated way in many places. But before we get into any of that, I should mention that Feral Druid can actually do very capable AoE DPS thanks to a pretty massive retooling in 8.1 and the addition of the Primal Wrath finisher as a talent, replacing arguably one of the most boring and poorly designed talents that have ever been in the game in Savage Roar. Their overall DPS will actually look quite good, in fact, especially on fortified weeks and in dungeons with particularly large reaps. But if you took a look at the damage profile and the abilities themselves, you would immediately understand the core issue Feral has. They have the worst burst and CD window of any spec in the entire game, and certainly out of any melee. In a meta where melee are lighting up the charts for hundreds of thousands of DPS on big pulls, Feral is slowly chugging along, exemplifying exactly what we described used to hold Shadow Priest back for the longest time. Still, to spend too much time on their offensive woes seems futile. They are well documented, and until they get a real CD and a less complicated rotation, Feral will remain underrepresented. A big issue here as it pertains to this tier list is how poorly they match up against a spec within their own class, that being Bombkin. If you thought the enhancement comparison was bad, Feral is worse in just about every way. It's clear that Bombkin's best strength is in its utility, but unlike the enhancement to elemental transition, Feral does not retain the strongest element of Bombkin's kit, namely Trance and Solar Beam. Those two abilities are not only potent, but entirely unique in a field of various specs, and if they were also present in Feral, a case certainly could be made for its viability. Instead, they seemingly have Stampeding Roar, which at least has some value in a timed dungeon world, but it's only especially useful out of combat, and again, just a weaker version than Bears. That being said, they can still Dispel Enrage, so if you're super desperate, they might have a place in Raging Weeks, and they can Dispel Poison, and a fair bit of off-healing provided to the group as well, but doing so is a huge hindrance for Feral. In order to provide this type of group-based utility, they're going to need to shift out of form, meaning a much larger DPS impact for them than it would have for Bombkin, and this will cascade likely into a bigger point of error when trying to maintain various bleeds on multiple targets. They also have an interrupt that is technically ranged, but will actually act as a gap closer as well, and of course still have access to battle res and knockback, which should still be looked at as valuable, just like they would have been for Enhance. In terms of defense, they are actually pretty capable. They have arguably the strongest single damage reduction CD in the game in Survival Instincts, which has a very long 3-minute CD attached to it, but offers 2 charges and a whopping 50% reduction. This is effectively all they have though, so if you use it frivolously, you will suffer, unlike other top bulk specs. Ultimately, their biggest hindrance is their reliance on Bombkin affinity for flexibility within melee. The extra range on their spells can add up and will be sorely missed if attempting to use Guardian or Resto affinity, and this ties into their last metric pretty well, mobility. They have a fair bit of mobility, considering how handcuffed the other specs can be at times, and with the slightly increased range can make up for any gap with ease, especially if their interrupt isn't needed, thanks also to the OG ability Dash. But again, to call their mobility anything other than average would be a kindness in a world with monks and demon hunters running around. So in the end, Feral is last overall yet again, and likely always will be held back by the loss of incredibly important utility spells when choosing not to play Bombkin. They truly have one of the least bursty DPS rotations ever in the game, thanks to arguably the lowest impact 3-minute CD to ever exist for any damage spec. So without yet another redesign, they likely won't ever fit in or shine in a world with so many more flexible melee slots. If I could suggest a fix for this problem other than redesigning their offense, I would suggest an entirely new and unique utility. As they are so similar to rogues, something along the lines of a mass stealth could be in order and would immediately shift the spec up the rankings dramatically. Even without this though, they are considerably better off than they were at 8.0 launch and in a much better position than they were in Legion. So don't be surprised if you see 1 or 2 sneak into into serious keys, especially ones that need battle res. Just realize that no matter how well they are playing, they could be bringing so much more as just about any other spec in the game, especially one they could simply switch to within their own class. Just like in previous picks, if you would like to shed some light on where they can separate from the pack, or even just places they can excel where Bombkin cannot, I'd love to hear it, because I am genuinely not aware of any. But for now, it seems impossible to imagine any other spec being surrounded by worse comparisons than Feral Druid is, who round off clearly this list as the lowest spec overall. So, that's the list. What'd you think? I want to remind everyone that these are exclusively my opinions, and yours certainly can and will differ. Many people may look at participation rates as a form of factual evidence for or against certain things said here, but it's much more pertinent to examine the kits, the dungeons, and the ups and downs each might present to try and understand why the representation is what it is, and not just blindly assume that it coincides perfectly with the hierarchy of specs. Studying the theory behind each pick will help you better understand why they are represented in such a way, and will help you form a more complete opinion than otherwise as well. Anyway, if you disagree with my list, I encourage you to tell me why, but must ask that out of respect to the time this took, you are prepared to compare all melee and or ranged along whichever metric you wish to give your opinion on. Far too many replies are people just simply disagreeing with my typically last few picks, but if you aren't willing to compare those picks to the top and explain why these picks should be higher, then you're missing the entire point of the video, and I simply won't have time to communicate with players doing this. Typically, I would also read and respond to every single comment on the video as it comes in, but instead, this time I'm going to be making an entire subsequent video where I'll read every single comment and reply to them at length in that video to prevent my own opinions from further creating bias in this comment section below, and also to allow for a longer form discussion to take place so that I can better learn places I might have gone wrong. Stay tuned, as after a few weeks of comments rolling in, I'll make that video and add it to the pinned comment down below. I want to thank you for watching and supporting the channel and the video. You should look forward to more tier lists like this coming in the future. If we have time to do a healing tier list, we may before Season 3 starts, depending on what we see from 8.2's timeline on the PTR. If not, we're just going to start back up with the re-examination of all 6 tank specs in the new seasonal affix as soon as that is playable and go from there. So thanks for watching, and we will see you guys in the next one.